Okay guys, let's now look at graphing a horizontal translation. And again, it's the same general form, which can be found on page 488. Okay, so again, here's my horizontal translation, and remember it's minus, so that would be 3 pi to which direction? Well, that's 3 pi right. Okay, so that 3 pi right is the shift of our cosine graph is going to be shifted 3 pi right. Okay, so I want to account for this first. So maybe I go over here and let's call this 3 pi. Okay. Because my starting point's no longer going to be 0, it's going to be here at 3 pi. And that's not really to scale, but again, I don't really necessarily need to put that to scale with the 0 there, since I'm going to only move in the positive direction here. Okay, so all right, once we have that 3 pi right, we want to account for our other transformations. Okay, it's got an A here of 5, an amplitude of 5. How about the period? Well, that's 2 pi over the absolute value of b. b is 1/2 here. Remember, if I have a fraction in the denominator, I'm going to invert and multiply. So my period is 2 pi multiplied by 2, or 4 pi. Okay, so remember, the period is the time it takes to complete one revolution. And so this time or distance, however you kind of want to look at it, you can kind of look at it both ways, of 4 pi. Well, I'm going to add that to my starting point of 3 pi. Okay, so I wanted to start with that translation right first, so that instead of adding that 4 pi to 0, I'm going to add it to this 3 pi. Well, that'll take me all the way out here to 7 pi. 3 pi plus 4 pi equals 7 pi. And then, of course, now I want to divide it in 4 equal pieces. Okay, so instead of starting at 0 here, I'm going to be starting at 3 pi. And instead of finishing, say, at 4 pi, if I started at 0, I'm going to finish at 7 pi because I added that 4 pi to my starting value. Okay, so this is where the period will finish, 7 pi. Okay, let's continue. So let's review. So I started with that horizontal translation, 3 pi to the right. And I marked it there on my midline. And again, my midline is just my x-axis if I haven't shifted it vertically like we looked at in the last video. And remember, if say we had both, say a vertical and a horizontal translation, of course I want to do that vertical shift first and draw that midline. And then, of course, I'll do the same process along that line. Okay, but in this case, we don't have a vertical translation. We just have the horizontal translation, an amplitude of 5, or vertical stretch of 5, and a period of 4 pi, which was a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. Okay, so what do we do now? Make a table. Let's start at 3 pi. Oh, sorry, we don't want to make a table just yet. We got to get our locations. Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Okay, so I know where it starts and I know where it ends, but I don't know these locations along the way. Well, I still do that same process of what? Well, taking the period of 4 pi and divided it in how many equal pieces? Well, 4. So that's pi. So whatever that value is, I'm going to add to my new starting point of 3 pi. Well, what's 3 pi plus pi? 4 pi. And now what's 4 pi plus pi? 5 pi. And what's 5 pi plus pi? 6 pi. And then finally 6 pi plus pi is 7 pi. 7 pi. And there I am. Okay, so don't forget then, take the period length here, divide it in 4, and you're going to add whatever that section is to your starting point. Not to 0, but to wherever your horizontal shift had shifted it to. Okay. Now let's make a table. Three pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, and of course we do 6 pi and 7 pi as well. All right, let me go ahead and erase. All right, let's evaluate f of 3 pi, our starting point. 5 cosine a half of 3 pi minus 3 pi. Notice I plugged in 3 pi for x there. Well, what's 3 pi minus 3 pi? 0. And 0 multiplied by a half is 0. So what's the cosine of 0? Well, I think what are my x values at 0 on the unit circle? Well, my x value should be 1 there. Multiplied by 5 is 5. Okay, f of 4 pi. 5 cosine a half of 4 pi minus 3 pi. 4 pi minus 3 pi is pi. Multiplied by a half is pi halves. So what's the cosine of pi halves? Well, I think on my unit circle, pi halves, that's a 0 on x, 1 on y, but I just need the x because that's cosine. 0 times 5 is 0. Okay, let's do 5 pi. Five cosine 1/2 5 pi minus 3 pi. 5 pi minus 3 pi is 2 pi times the half is pi. So I've got the cosine of pi times 5. Okay, the cosine of pi is -1. Multiplied by 5 gives me -5. And then, of course, I'd go through and evaluate the rest of my points. Okay, now I've evaluated all my points and plotted them. And notice, remember, since this is a cosine graph, not a sine, I'm not going to be starting, say, at 0 or my midline. I'm going to be starting up at whatever the amplitude is. And so this looks like it makes sense. Go down to your trough. And back up to your peaks here. Okay, and now notice I went from 3 pi here to 7 pi. I didn't start at 0. I started at whatever that horizontal translation was. And then again, I took my period, I divided it in 4 parts, and then I added that amount to my starting value of 3 pi to find my intermediate locations. Okay, we've got an amplitude of 5. From our midpoint to our highest point is 5. We've got a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. So notice our period, instead of being 2 pi, is 4 pi, essentially. And we've got a shift of 3 pi right. Okay, thank you.